The rain tapped faintly against the tall windows of the ceremonial hall, echoing like nervous fingertips drumming across Hikaru's heart. It was supposed to be the happiest day of his life, or at least that's how weddings were advertised. Instead, this felt like an execution disguised in silk. He stood in front of a grand altar, dressed in a traditional white Mansuki haori, hands trembling at his sides, lips pressed into a thin, pale line. His adoptive parents sat in the front row, rigid, their eyes calculating, mouths twitching with veiled urgency. As far as they were concerned, today was not about love, unity, or even dignity. It was a transaction, a trade of flesh for finances, and Hikaru, he was the currency. Across the aisle stood Renjiro, older by at least a decade, with a chiseled jaw, dark eyes that looked like they hadn't softened in years, and the kind of presence that silenced a room with a mere glance. He was every bit the corporate predator the tabloids whispered about, sharp, reserved, and impenetrably cold. But beneath that intimidating exterior, Hikaru could see something unreadable. Renjiro was clearly just as disinterested in the ceremony as Hikaru was, but there was something else in his gaze. Not disdain, not boredom, curiosity. The ceremony began, priests chanting solemnly, incense rising like ghosts between them. The room smelled of old wood, jasmine, and ceremonial sake. Hikaru barely registered the words being spoken. All he could hear was his adoptive mother's voice replaying in his mind. Get close to him. Earn his trust. Find the files. That inheritance isn't for his hands alone. That had been the final instruction, delivered in a whisper so venomous it felt like acid in his ear. The debt they owed was immense. Millions, she had said, with trembling hands and a fake motherly smile. This was Hikaru's duty now, to make himself indispensable to Renjiro, and then bleed him dry for information. Renjiro barely looked at him as they stood side by side. His voice was steady as he repeated the ceremonial vows, monotone and devoid of even the pretense of affection. When it was Hikaru's turn, his voice faltered only once, on the word trust. A flicker in Renjiro's eyes. A tightening of the jaw. Did he notice? Then something happened. As the final blessing was being uttered, a soft light shimmered near Hikaru's feet. At first he thought it was a trick of the incense smoke, or perhaps exhaustion from weeks of stress and self-loathing. But the light grew, gently pulsing, forming into a small shape, a creature no larger than a cat, with 9 ethereal tails flowing behind it, eyes glowing gold. A kitsune, a fox spirit. Its presence was not aggressive but watchful, delicate. It sat beside Hikaru's kimono hem, looking up at him with something like recognition. No one else noticed. Not the guests, not the priests, not even Renjiro. Only Hikaru saw it. Its eyes shimmered with something unspoken. Not just magic, but knowing. It was not comforting. It was a reminder of something buried, or something yet to come. He tried not to flinch. Renjiro was now looking directly at him. It was the first time in the entire ceremony their eyes truly met, not just brushed past each other. Renjiro's stare was not affectionate, not yet, but something had clearly shifted. His gaze lingered, not on Hikaru's trembling lips or his ceremonial dress, but on his eyes. There was something there Renjiro hadn't expected. A softness, a flicker of pain, maybe, or fear, or restraint. You don't want to be here, Renjiro said quietly under his breath, as the guests stood and clapped politely. Hikaru didn't reply. He couldn't. He was afraid his voice would betray too much. The reception followed like clockwork, every move scripted, every smile practiced. They toasted with sweet plum wine under paper lanterns, while family members made thinly veiled speeches about legacy, duty and sacrifice. The word love was never uttered once. Hikaru played his part, folding into the role as expected. Gentle, gracious, submissive, he stood beside Renjiro, like an ornament, smiling just enough, bowing when needed. It was a performance, and he was flawless at it. Every step, every breath choreographed to avoid suspicion. Even the press photos would show a serene newlywed, not the shameful marionette he felt like. Renjiro, for his part, remained stiff. He didn't touch Hikaru once, during the entire reception, except when absolutely necessary. But he kept watching him, not with affection, with scrutiny. Hikaru could feel it, like a hand pressing into the center of his back. Later that night, alone in their hotel suite, Renjiro finally broke the silence. You don't strike me as the type who does this willingly, he said, without looking up, unbuttoning his vest, eyes focused on the city skyline. So why did you say yes? Hikaru sat rigid on the edge of the bed, the ceremonial layers of his attire neatly folded beside him. His voice came slowly, carefully. Does it matter? Renjiro turned to him. It does to me. A pause, heavy. Then Renjiro stepped closer, enough to close the distance, but not to touch. His voice was quieter now, almost cautious. There's something in your eyes. Hikaru froze. Had he seen it too? The resignation, the flicker of guilt, or worse, the hesitation that had been there from the moment he vowed to betray him. Is that so? Hikaru said flatly. Yes, Renjiro murmured. They're not like the others I've met. Yours don't want to take, they're afraid they have no choice. That struck too close. Hikaru looked away, his throat tightening. The kitsune had vanished hours ago, but its image still lingered in his mind, golden and ancient, eyes filled with warning. Renjiro didn't press him. He simply turned and walked toward the balcony. If you ever decide to tell me the truth, he said over his shoulder, make sure it's for you, not them. The door clicked shut behind him, and Hikaru sat alone in the silence, wondering if the marriage was the real trap, or if the trap was the part of himself that still wanted to believe. Renjiro's voice had held something other than calculation, that maybe, just maybe, someone had seen him, not as a pawn, but as a person, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. Renjiro's mansion stood atop a private hill, like a lacquered tomb. It was vast, sprawling, and aggressively sterile. The floors were white marble, polished to a mirrored finish that made footsteps sound like echoes in a cathedral. Every room was soaked in silence, every wall coated in matte white or sterile gray, every edge too sharp, too deliberate. There were no family photos, no signs of life. The paintings were abstract, cold shapes that looked like wounds frozen in time. Hikaru was not told to make himself at home. He was told where to walk, where to sleep, and what doors were locked. The rest, he was expected to understand on his own. The morning after their wedding, Renjiro handed him a thin document, a printed set of household rules. You don't need to pretend, he said, not even looking at him. Just follow these. There were rules for everything. No entering Renjiro's wing of the estate without written permission. No meals shared unless otherwise summoned. No guests. No unnecessary noise after 9 p.m. No changes to the interior without written consent. No contact with outside media, and no questions. Renjiro was clear. This was not a home. It was a holding pen. Hikaru signed it silently and returned to his new quarters. 2 rooms on the east wing, spacious but void of comfort. The walls were white, the bedsheets were white, even the curtains filtered out color. At night, the wind passed through the tall windows and made the glass creak like a warning. He began making tea. It wasn't asked of him. There was no order, no instruction. But each evening, after all the lights had dimmed and the staff had vanished to their own quarters, Hikaru would walk silently down the hall with a single porcelain cup on a lacquered tray. He'd set it gently just outside Renjiro's study. He never knocked, never said a word. He just left it, bowed slightly, and retreated. At first, it sat untouched. Then after 3 nights, the cup began returning empty. He noticed it the way one notices a shift in weather, subtle, but impossible to ignore. One night, he lingered a little longer, and saw it, the faintest wisp of steam curling out of the teacup, slowly twisting into the shape of a crane. It hovered briefly, delicate and warm, before vanishing into the air. A crane, he had read about them. Messengers of peace, symbols of sincerity. The tea was just jasmine and yuzu peel, but somehow the steam always formed the same shape, always when Renjiro drank. Still, Renjiro never spoke about it. Days in the mansion blurred together, like white brushstrokes. Hikaru wandered its corridors like a ghost, never quite belonging, never quite noticed. The staff were cold and professional. He was not mistreated, but neither was he seen. Even meals were eaten separately. Renjiro would occasionally call for him, ask mundane questions about schedules, social obligations, or signatures, and then dismiss him with curt nods. Hikaru answered quietly, politely, always from the proper distance. He slept lightly. Nights in the mansion were strange, quiet, but full of pressure, like the air was too thick with unspoken things. The tea became ritual. Every cup he left was more than an offering, it was a message. I'm still here, I haven't run. I know you're watching. Then came Monica. She arrived like a windstorm, slamming the front door open with a gust of perfume, earrings that danced like wind chimes, and a voice that sliced through the mansion's silence like a red-hot blade. "Where's my husband?" she bellowed, not looking for an answer. "Kidding, don't answer that. Just show me where I'm not supposed to be, so I can start there." She was dressed in bright purple with gold bangles, and a grin that dared anyone to correct her. The staff looked horrified. Hikaru didn't know what to make of her, until she turned and smiled directly at him. "You must be the little teacup ghost," she said. "About time someone brought a soul into this place." She called herself Madame Momiji, though Hikaru suspected that wasn't her real name. She claimed she had worked for Renjiro's family for years, before he became a refrigerator with legs, as she described him. "And now I'm back to poke the dragon," she added, winking. Hikaru had no idea what she meant, but Monica didn't wait for understanding. She moved through the house like a comet, opening windows, tossing out wilted arrangements, replacing dry ikebana with fresh blooms. She banished the silence. Music returned, low old jazz records spinning in the kitchen. Color returned, orange tea towels, red lacquered trays, cushions she borrowed from unused sitting rooms. Renjiro didn't stop her, which stunned everyone, but he didn't welcome it either. He remained distant, only occasionally passing through common rooms, with a look that said he didn't have the energy to fight it. Hikaru watched him carefully, noting every glance, every hesitation. The rules hadn't changed, but the house had. Hikaru continued the tea ritual, now adding small origami cranes, folded from parchment scraps. He didn't leave notes, just the shapes, placed silently next to the cups. Every night, the cups returned empty. Every morning, the cranes were gone. Then, one evening, Hikaru arrived at the study door, and found it open. Renjiro sat at his desk, sleeves rolled, collar unfastened. The room smelled of books and sandalwood. He didn't look up from his documents, but said quietly, "You don't have to leave it outside anymore." It was not kindness, it was a command. Hikaru stepped in, placed the tray carefully on the edge of the desk. He bowed. Renjiro picked up the cup, examined the steam rising from it. Sure enough, the crane shimmered there, wings spread wide, hovering like breath made visible. Renjiro didn't speak for a long time. "You're not like them," he said at last. Hikaru kept his gaze lowered. "I'm not trying to be." "Don't lie," Renjiro said, voice sharpening. "Everyone wants something, even you." Hikaru didn't flinch. "Maybe, but I haven't taken it yet." A silence. Renjiro drank. The crane vanished. He didn't dismiss Hikaru this time. He just returned to his work, and Hikaru, after a moment of stillness, left without a word. Outside, Monica was waiting near the hallway corner, arms crossed. "That man is a locked shrine," she muttered. "But you've cracked something." "I've seen it. I don't want to crack anything," Hikaru replied softly. "No," she said. "But that's what makes it worse." Monica started giving him small things. Hand-woven coasters for the tea tray, a tiny pink fan to cool the pot, a ceramic fox she placed quietly on his nightstand. "For luck," she said, then added with a raised brow, "and because this house needs watching." She became his only warmth in the house, a riot of color and comfort in a world built from control. She never asked questions, she never pried, but she watched. She saw the bruises of loneliness in Hikaru's silence. She saw how he stood straighter when Renjiro passed. She saw the shame in his eyes when he caught his reflection, because Hikaru knew, every day, that he was a spy in someone else's life. Every cup of tea was a betrayal hidden in ritual. Every origami crane was a lie wrapped in sincerity. And yet, he kept doing it, because something had changed. One night, Renjiro summoned him, without reason, said nothing, just sat in his library, while Hikaru stood awkwardly nearby. Minutes passed in silence. Finally, Renjiro asked, "Do you believe in sincerity?" The question hit harder than Hikaru expected. "I don't know," he said, "but I try." "Trying is dangerous," Renjiro replied. They didn't speak again that night, but the tea was drunk, and in the silence between them, something started to tremble. Hikaru's family called occasionally, demanding updates, threatening consequences. "We didn't sell you into a wedding, just to have you fall asleep," his mother hissed once over the phone.
You're supposed to get into his files, not his habits. He hung up and vomited in the guest bathroom. Every kindness he gave Renjiro felt like treason. Every small softness was a humiliation, proof that he was failing the people who had raised him, for a man who barely looked him in the eye. But he kept folding cranes, and Renjiro kept drinking. And one morning, Hikaru found a single crane on his pillow, perfectly folded, gold parchment, no note, just the shape of something beginning, or breaking, or both. The lecture hall buzzed with casual arrogance, the type that hovered over graduate seminars, like static. Hikaru sat near the back, his plain notebook open and pencil in hand. The others barely noticed him. Some recognized him as that quiet guy who married Renjiro Kanzaki. Most assumed he was a donor's pet, or a bored socialite coasting on someone else's wealth. No one knew he was enrolled under a different name. No one cared. At the board, the professor was pacing in front of a whiteboard, covered in symbols, logic trees, recursive systems, and one staggeringly complex equation that refused to resolve. A computational architecture problem, the professor said, one used in high-level data encryption algorithms. No one's cracked this configuration in application yet. Most of you won't either, he added dryly. But it's good mental exercise, unless anyone wants to try. Silence, heads ducked, then a sound pencil on paper. Hikaru didn't raise his hand, he didn't move, didn't announce himself, but line by line, his pencil scratched out symbols with surgical precision. He didn't look up. As the room shifted awkwardly, someone noticed. A girl nudged her friend, who leaned forward to see. By the time the professor approached, Hikaru had flipped to the next page and begun writing again, unaware, or uncaring, that his notebook was now glowing faintly, just enough that the air around it shimmered, with subtle threads of light, flickering into arcane shapes, runes, talismans, geometry, ancient and unknown. They faded as he wrote, like breath vanishing in winter air. He tore the page out silently, and stood. No one spoke. He walked down the steps, and handed it to the professor, bowing slightly, before returning to his seat. The room didn't breathe. The professor glanced at the page, eyes narrowing. This is wait. This is a complete restructure. A pause. This is correct. The silence snapped into whispers. Someone clapped quietly, then stopped. Hikaru didn't react. He packed his things, and left before the buzz reached him. By the time the others began asking who he was, he had already vanished from the hall. He returned to the mansion, where Renjiro's company had just been hit with its worst cyber breach in over a decade. The news was spreading like poison. Finance outlets speculated about ransomware. Employees whispered about layoffs. Renjiro locked himself in his study, barking into secure lines, eyes shadowed from sleeplessness. The mansion was tense. Staff whispered. Madame Momiji smacked a broom loudly against the floor to break the silence. Hikaru said nothing. That night, instead of tea, he left a folded piece of paper on the tray. The note bore no name, no address, just a string of code, obscure, angular, written in a hand that had forgotten what hesitation felt like. Beneath the code, he drew a symbol, a crane in flight, stylized in 3 strokes. Beneath that, one word, patch. Renjiro didn't touch it until morning. The breach had already taken his night, his patience, and his voice. He stared at the tray, at the envelope, and slowly opened it. By noon, the ET team had implemented the string. By afternoon, the breach had closed. The source traced, the system scrubbed clean. It was as though the code had anticipated the hack before it happened, like someone had built a lock from inside the vault. Renjiro said nothing. That evening, for the first time since the wedding, he sent a message to Hikaru. Join me for dinner. 8. The message had no warmth. Just wait. Hikaru came in quietly. The dining room, once reserved for officials and plastic family functions, felt different. The long table, usually set for 20, was shortened to 4 seats. Only 2 were used. A single lamp cast warm light onto the table's dark lacquered surface. The room smelled of rice, miso, and something seared. Renjiro didn't speak as Hikaru sat. They ate in silence. No one else entered. No questions were asked. But something had shifted. An unseen thread. Stretched, but not tense. The meal was quiet, but not empty. When Renjiro refilled Hikaru's tea, his hand brushed the teacup, just slightly longer than necessary. Not affection, curiosity. You never asked me what the breach was, Renjiro said finally. Hikaru lifted his eyes briefly. I assumed you wouldn't answer, and yet you left me the fix. I don't like chaos, Hikaru replied, even when it doesn't belong to me. Renjiro watched him for a long time. You're not ordinary. I've never been allowed to be. A crane-shaped wisp floated up from the teacup. Renjiro watched it until it disappeared. Later that night, when Hikaru returned to his room, his notebook sat open on his desk. He didn't remember leaving it there. On the page where he had written the breach code, faint glowing lines began to stir. Arcane shapes formed in the corners, circles layered with runes, numbers that slid into place like constellations. As he stared, the lines blinked once, then faded again, as though hiding. He shut the book quietly. He didn't tell anyone, not even Monica, who had begun bringing him dried fruit and whispering, "I told you so," without context. At breakfast, the next day, there was an envelope at his place. Inside a single card, Renjiro's handwriting, sparse and sharp. "Next time, tell me what else you see." No signature, no thanks, but Hikaru read it 3 times, then folded it, carefully, into the shape of a crane. The marble walls of the mansion's east wing were slick with condensation as water hammered against Hikaru's skin. He sat curled on the shower floor, back hunched, knees pulled to his chest. The water had long turned lukewarm, but he didn't move. He didn't wipe the tears from his face, didn't bother pretending they were just droplets. They weren't. They were heavier, saltier, honest. The steam filled the stall like a suffocating fog, but it wasn't enough to hide the sound. His breath hitched, chest collapsing in gasps. He tried to suppress, but the sobs escaped anyway, first quietly, then sharper, louder, until they echoed faintly against the sterile walls. It wasn't about one thing. It never was. It was everything. The silence of the house, the weight of a marriage built on lies, the humiliation of caring for someone he was meant to exploit, the slow betrayal of his own heart, the ache of being invisible, in a place where every surface sparkled, but no warmth existed, the guilt, the loneliness, his parents' voices, the quiet resentment of tea rituals that had become prayers. He pressed his forehead to the tile. His shoulders trembled. No one saw, but when he finally dragged himself out, dried his face, and slipped on his robe, he found something waiting, just outside his door. A blanket, soft, heavy, and warm, folded with care, not precision, not the kind the staff would prepare. This was human. It smelled faintly of sandalwood and cedar, the scent that lingered in Renjiro's study. No note, no explanation, just the unspoken message. "I heard you." I didn't walk away. Hikaru stood frozen, one hand pressed to his mouth. For a moment he couldn't breathe. He took the blanket inside. He didn't say thank you, not out loud, but he folded it every morning, placed it carefully over the foot of the bed. It began with that, the smallest of fractures in the glacier that had been their emotional distance. Then came the rain, a downpour that washed over the mansion for 3 days, without pause. The air turned damp and cold, and with it, Renjiro fell ill, quietly, stubbornly. He denied it at first, refused help, hid it behind closed doors, as though sickness was a weakness he couldn't afford. But Hikaru noticed. He noticed the silence that stretched longer than usual, the unopened tea tray, the untouched meals, and finally, Renjiro's slumped figure behind his desk, hand trembling faintly, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. He didn't ask permission. He stepped in, placed his fingers gently to Renjiro's wrist, burning, skin like live coals. "You're sick," he whispered. Renjiro tried to pull away. "I'm fine." "You're not." Hikaru's voice cracked. "You don't have to pretend." That night he stayed. He boiled rice porridge in the kitchen himself, though the staff watched in stunned silence. Madame Momiji didn't say a word, just handed him a jar of grated ginger, and turned away quickly, wiping her eyes. He fed Renjiro by hand. When his strength failed him, wiped his forehead with a cool cloth, sat by the bedside with a notebook in his lap, pretending to read while his fingers trembled from fear he wouldn't name. Renjiro didn't speak for hours, but when he finally opened his eyes, he asked hoarsely, "Why are you here?" Hikaru didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "Because I care." The silence that followed was heavier than anything Hikaru had known. Renjiro blinked slowly, confusion darkening his gaze, as if those words weren't just foreign, they were offensive, as if no one had ever said them without a price attached. You shouldn't, Renjiro muttered, eyes closing again. But his hand didn't pull away when Hikaru tucked the blanket tighter. In the morning, Renjiro woke to find the tea tray beside him, and the cup was warm. Days passed, the illness faded, but something remained. That night, Hikaru wandered into the garden after dinner, needing air. The rain had cleared, leaving the air clean, but bitterly cold. He sat alone near the koi pond, knees drawn up, arms hugging his sides. He didn't cry at first, but as the stars came out, one by one, he felt it break again. Something deep inside him, something bruised and vulnerable. His chest ached, his breath trembled, and then it came again. The same helpless, silent sobbing that choked him with shame. He bit his hand to muffle it, and that's when they came. The fireflies, soft at first, just a few drifting in the dark, then more, dozens, hundreds. They gathered around him, forming faint golden lines that shimmered in the darkness. Slowly, they curved upward, a pattern, a shape, wings, not real ones, but the outline of wings, vast and soft, forming a quiet shield around his body, as if nature itself was trying to offer him dignity, if not peace. He cried inside them, let it all out, and no one saw, except maybe the spirit of the house, or something older, hidden in the earth beneath the garden. When he returned, Renjiro was standing by the hallway. He didn't ask where Hikaru had gone, but he held the soft blanket in his arms again, already folded. Without speaking, he handed it over. Hikaru accepted it, eyes red, but gaze steady. Thank you, he whispered this time. Renjiro didn't look away. You shouldn't care about me, he said again, voice quiet. I already do. Renjiro turned his face slightly, as if the words stung more than they should. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to, Hikaru said. Not yet. He turned and walked to his room. Renjiro didn't follow. But the next morning, the tea tray was gone, and on Hikaru's pillow was a single white crane, folded carefully, with steady hands.
They left for Geneva under the pretense of image control. The public wants to see us happy, Renjiro said flatly, scanning the itinerary prepared by his international PR team. The investors want to see I'm stable. Hikaru nodded without meeting his eyes. He knew what this was, a presentation, an exhibition of unity between powerful men, never mind the truth curled beneath it. The plane was quiet. Hikaru stared out the window, pretending not to notice how Renjiro glanced over more often than before. The space between them had shrunk since the illness, since the tea trays, since the blanket. Geneva in autumn was glass clear and expensive. Their hotel sat on the edge of the lake, windows wide and high, overlooking water as smooth as slate. The staff were polished, impersonal. The suite was larger than Hikaru's childhood apartment. No one expected him to speak during the welcome dinner with Renjiro's board associates. He simply sat at Renjiro's side, hands folded, face still, silent, elegant, necessary. But that night, when the door closed and the suite was theirs alone, Hikaru didn't go to his room. He lingered by the window, eyes on the glittering skyline across the lake. Renjiro stood beside him. Neither of them said anything for a long time. I don't know what this is anymore, Renjiro said eventually, voice quieter than Hikaru had ever heard it. It's not a transaction, Hikaru answered. No, Renjiro agreed. It stopped being that somewhere between your tea and your silence. Hikaru's breath caught. He didn't trust his voice. He just nodded once. Renjiro's hand brushed his sleeve. When they turned to face each other fully, something passed between them. Not dramatic, not loud. Just an ache, quiet and unbearable. And then, without ceremony, they leaned in. The kiss was not scripted, not a show for cameras or strategy. It was hesitant, warm, real, and as it happened, across the wide windows behind them, the lights of Geneva's skyline shimmered, street by street, building by building, flickering softly in a wave, as if the city had held its breath, waiting for something to align. Neither of them noticed. The next morning, Hikaru's account was flagged. The breach was subtle, a script executed from within, masked under administrative behavior. The IT team caught it on a routine sweep, an outbound packet, traced to an encrypted shell. They brought the report to Renjiro. Renjiro said nothing for a full minute. Then, slowly, his hand clenched over the document. Whose credentials were used? Hikaru Kanzaki. A silence cut through the room like a wire drawn tight. That evening, back in the suite, Renjiro didn't speak when Hikaru entered. He just turned his laptop around. Explain this. The terminal was still open. Hikaru stared. The code was familiar, not his. He didn't lie. It's Daichi, he said. My brother, your brother hacked my company? He used me. Hikaru's voice was hoarse. He used my credentials. He's the one they wanted me to spy for. Renjiro said nothing. I didn't tell you because I was trying to make them proud. I owed them. They raised me. They paid for everything. I was just supposed to get close. Find files. Build access. Report. And you did. No. Renjiro's eyes sharpened. I didn't. Hikaru said again. I couldn't. I started to care, and it humiliated me. I hated myself for how much I wanted you to trust me. The words came fast, unsteady, pulled up from somewhere deep and raw. I hated the way I waited outside your door like some forgotten thing. I hated the way I smiled for photos like a decoration. I hated the tea, the silence, the garden, the fireflies, all of it. But I kept doing it. I kept caring, and I stopped sending reports. His voice cracked. I burned everything. Every message. Every instruction. I didn't give them anything. I couldn't. Because it wasn't about them anymore. Renjiro didn't move. I'm sorry, Hikaru whispered. I tried to be the perfect tool. I tried to be cold. I tried not to feel anything. But I fell. And now all I've done is ruin you. Renjiro turned off the laptop. Then he stepped forward and said, no, you ruined them. The flight home was silent again, but not cold. 2 days later, the Minami family's empire cracked. In a press release, Kanzaki International publicly denounced a third-party entity, responsible for attempting to infiltrate protected systems under a falsified family trust. A quiet investigation led to the unmasking of Daichi Minami, and a string of shell companies he used to siphon proprietary data for competitors. Kanzaki's legal division filed a restraining order. Financial partners pulled support from Minami Holdings. One by one, their accounts froze, their assets seized. Within a week, the Minami family was buried in scandal. Renjiro never once mentioned Hikaru's name, not to the press, not to the board, not in the paperwork. But that night, when Hikaru walked through the mansion hall, the place didn't feel cold. He found his room's door open, and on the bed, folded in layers, was the soft blanket, with a note on top. You don't belong to them, you never did. Signed with a single symbol, a crane, drawn in black ink, wings open, still flying. The mansion no longer echoed with loneliness. Laughter replaced silence. Real laughter, the kind that startled the walls, and made the antique vases seem less judgmental. The hallways once walked like funeral aisles, now carried warmth. Footsteps were no longer hesitant. Plates clinked at breakfast. Someone hummed in the kitchen. Sometimes it was Monica, still insisting on being called Madame Momiji. Sometimes it was Hikaru. Renjiro no longer hid in his study, until dusk. Meals were shared now, quietly at first, then fully. They sat across from each other, and spoke about things that had no strategic value. Music, gardens, books neither had read. Renjiro listened more than he spoke. Hikaru noticed. It happened during one of those board meetings. One Renjiro had invited Hikaru to, not as an ornament, but as a presence. The executives had been discussing the energy sector, analyzing stagnant investment curves, and aging infrastructure proposals. One of them mentioned, half dismissively, an experimental power loop, buried in a footnote, something about kinetic fluid oscillation and microgrids, briefly piloted in the Swiss Alps. It was quickly ignored, but Hikaru heard it. That night, he stayed up late, scribbling on napkins, then diagrams, then spreadsheets. By dawn, his room was covered in hand-drawn schematics. His notebook glowed faintly again, arcane symbols flickering at the page margins. He barely noticed. 3 days later, he handed Renjiro a folder. This is either delusional, Hikaru said, or the future. Renjiro read it, twice. The following week, Kanzaki International announced Project Yushi, a green energy initiative that promised to decentralize energy production through modular kinetic cores, compact, scalable, nearly self-sustaining. At the press conference, Renjiro stood at the podium in front of the world and said, "This was designed by my husband." The crowd hushed. He's not a figurehead. He's not a spouse by contract. He's a visionary. For the first time, cameras focused on Hikaru not with curiosity, but with awe. Hikaru stood beside Renjiro, expression unreadable, but inside, something bloomed, something he never thought he'd feel in public: pride. Renjiro reached for his hand under the podium, held it. Monica cried in the back row, muttering, "About damn time." Months passed, and then, quietly, Renjiro asked, "Will you marry me again?" Hikaru stared at him, mouth open, shocked. "We already are." "Not like this," Renjiro said. "Not because they told us to. Not for business, for real." They held the ceremony in the garden, the same garden where fireflies had once shielded Hikaru as he cried, where cranes had hovered in steam, where he had once felt like a ghost in someone else's life. This time, he wore a white haori trimmed with red. Renjiro wore black, simple and sharp. Only 10 guests were invited. Monica officiated, with ridiculous earrings and barely disguised tears. "I, Renjiro Kanzaki," he said, voice low but steady, "choose you." "I, Hikaru Manami Kanzaki," he answered, "choose you." They didn't need poetry. They had survived the collapse of lies. They had rebuilt something sacred, with nothing but ashes and honesty. As they bowed to one another, a flash of white passed overhead. Monica gasped. Floating high above, a great white phoenix traced a slow, silent arc over the sky, wings made of drifting light and invisible flame. No one else seemed to notice, only her. She wiped a tear and whispered, "A blessing." Later that night, in the quiet of their bedroom, Hikaru sat beside Renjiro, beneath the dim light of the city outside. The window was half open. A cool breeze carried the scent of moss and jasmine. "You're safe with me," Renjiro said softly. "Every night now." Hikaru never answered. He only nodded, and leaned closer, memorizing the warmth of that voice. He remembered who he was, a boy who had once been sold into a marriage as leverage, a son ordered to betray, a tool in a plan that should have ended in ruin. But what he had stolen wasn't a file, or wealth, or secrets. It was Renjiro's heart, and somewhere along the way, he'd given his own. Now he was a quiet force behind a global empire. Engineers cited his designs, economists whispered about his theories, investors respected him, and Renjiro loved him, not just quietly, openly. Every night, Renjiro touched his shoulder and said, "You're safe with me," and Hikaru believed it. He had taken the life handed to him, like a noose, and turned it into something gentle, powerful, free. Outside their window, the city hummed. On the side of the Kanzaki Tower, the newest building in the skyline, digital screens shifted as midnight approached. A program display flickered to life, petal by petal, glowing softly against the steel and glass. A digital sakura blossom unfurled across the entire face of the tower, blooming in delicate pink and white. No name, no message, just the blossom, a love letter written in light, for the entire city to see, but only one person to understand.